Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good afternoon, good evening for those coming in from the East Coast, and welcome to Amplify 2020. This is not what we intended to be doing today. Actually, it is. It's just not the way we intended to be doing it. Amplify is a full-day conference, an in-person conference we started last year. And it was very well received, and we were geared up to do it today on June 15th, 2020. And of course, the world's changed. So here we are. We've decided to shift Amplify this year to a series of online discussions. It's not the same as being in person, but it has the advantage that we can include people from around the world. And we have many attendees from the East Coast who probably couldn't have made it out here to San Francisco. So Amplify has been about sharing real-world practical advice from entrepreneurs in many disciplines and from many backgrounds. And our online series will continue to do just that. For the first of these today, we thought we would start at the beginning. Literally, what drives people to decide to build a startup? How do they decide when's the best time to do it? And how to get it started? And of course, we're going to pay particular put emphasis on how the environment has changed in mid-2020, new motivations and obstacles, and the funding environment that's changed as well. So we will be discussing that throughout the presentation. Quick intro on who I am. My name is Josh Goldman. I'm the class of 88. At Tufts, longtime Bay Area entrepreneur originally, then venture capitalist, and now angel investor. I began my entrepreneurship really at Tufts and continued thereafter. Several startups, some big wins, some that struggled, and became what we like to call learning experiences. We don't say they're failures, we say they're learning experiences. And I've got some of each. I became a partner at Norwest Venture Partners in 2007 and was there as a general partner for 12 years. I'm now building a new fund called Catapult. So very briefly, thank you to the Amplify team here in San Francisco, to the Tufts Entrepreneurship Center, Kevin Oy, Office of Alumni Relations, Jabari and Jerry, to Amy McDonald, Bill Labin, my colleagues on the East Coast at TEEN, that's the Tufts Entrepreneurship Alumni Network, particularly Josh Kappelman, Iggy Molliver, and thanks also to the Tufts tech team making this all work behind the scenes. Very quickly, I'll mention our upcoming events. The next event is June 30th, and that's the TEEN team on the East Coast. And that will be part of their series, Tufts Entrepreneurs Tackling Tough Questions. And they will be focusing on the food and beverage industry on June 30th. So look for registration for that or do a search. It's open now, I believe. And the next Amplify series, the next event will be July 27th. And that is lessons and learnings from recent graduates who are on their entrepreneurial journey. That'll be hosted by Shreya Navatia. And Shreya's here. Shreya, can you give us a quick description of your July 27th event?
Thanks so much, Josh. Nice to meet you all, everybody. So my name is Shreya, and I graduated in the class of 2015. So I wanted to put together this event to spotlight some of the recent graduates who built a startup fairly early on in their career. So just a highlight of the panelists, we'll have Charles Cushing, who is class of 2011, and most recently co-founder of Galleon, which is a transportation analytics platform. Then Patrick Cochran, who was actually a Teal Fellow and is co-founder of Foxtrot Systems, a logistics AI platform. And McGill Davis, class of 2015, who is has most recently co-founder of HumbleDot, which is an HR platform. And I myself ran a company called the Violet Society, where we built an accelerator for female and non-binary people in tech. And all of us will just talk a little bit about those very early founding journeys, especially when you may not have that much work experience before that to begin with. But that's coming up on the 27th. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Shreya. Looking forward to that, July 27th. Last quick intro, my co-host is a classmate of mine from the class of '88, a member of the Amplify committee, Judy Goldman, who also happens to be my wife of 27 years. Judy has had a career in management consulting, HR, and ultimately in corporate community engagement before shifting her priorities to prominent Silicon Valley education and social justice nonprofits, currently chairing the advisory board of Facing History and Ourselves, a national organization focused on giving teachers actionable lessons from history to address bias, racism, hatred, and inequality. Judy's going to be hosting the Q&A part of today. Judy, you want to tell us how that will work?
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank everyone for giving Josh and I the opportunity to be co-anchors and co-hosts. It's kind of a lifelong dream to be able to co-anchor something, so thanks. So I'll be administering the Q&A today, and you'll see at the bottom of your screen that there is a Q&A option. Just feel free to type in a question you have relevant to what our speakers are talking about, and we will either attempt to insert that question into the natural conversation that they may be having, or save it until a later point in our conversations. We invite any and all questions, and if you have any issues, you can also feel free to chat to the folks who are managing behind the scenes. Thanks.
Great. Well, with that, let's get to our amazing speakers we've got for today. Ron Croen, class of '76, is the founder of Nuance Communications. He took that company from 4 employees to an IPO in an amazing 6 years, incredibly short. Market cap of $5 billion. Today, he's partner at You and Mr. Jones, Brandtech Ventures, and a repeat entrepreneur who's back at it again now as one of Tufts' newest entrepreneurs with a startup he's building that'll directly address COVID-19 health and safety in communities. We're going to get a first look at that today. Our other panelist speaker today is Kowsik Guruswamy, the co-founder and CTO of Menlo Security, a repeat entrepreneur, and someone who has a particular interest in the how and why entrepreneurs get started. So with that, let me ask each of you, starting with Kowsik, let's have each of you give your quick story, 5 minutes. Tell us, how your path evolved, maybe from college to today in 5 minutes.
Okay, timer starts now. Thanks, Josh. I'm Kowsik, currently Chief Technology Officer with Menlo Security. My association with Tufts in this panel is I have a rising sophomore, Niall Slow. And somehow we just got connected, and it's fantastic to be on this panel. I guess the condensed version of the journey is I got my master's in computer science, not from Tufts, but from University of Louisiana. And I moved to the Bay Area in 95. Worked in a couple of startups doing 3D graphics, flight simulators, visual simulation, that kind of stuff. Summer 2000, I decided to quit my second job and said, okay, I'm going to start a company. And well, that didn't go very well. And it didn't get very far either. 2 months and a dwindling checking account later, one of my buddies I'd worked with before, he said, hey, why don't you come to this startup? It's a cybersecurity startup. So I joined OneSecure, and I helped build the first, what's called the intrusion prevention device. You can think of it as a router firewall, like an enterprise version of it, that basically blocks all kinds of attacks on the network. And then a couple of years later, we got acquired by a company called NetScreen, and then got acquired again by Juniper Networks. So 2005, I left Juniper after just a year there. And I also have to say it's the largest company I've ever worked for. So I left and started my own company called New Dynamics with another co-founder. Several years of fun, learning, excitement, downturn, battle scars, and a whole lot of white hair. Later sold the company, and then joined Menlo Security as a Chief Technology Officer pretty early on. I was probably the 3rd or 4th person here. And I've been with them for about 7 years now. So less than 5 minutes, but that's sort of the short story.
Great, thank you. And Ron, why don't you give us the brief version of your story?
Okay, thanks, Josh. Good to be here. I went to law school. I always thought I was supposed to be a lawyer after I graduated Tufts. So I headed off to Penn Law and did my 3 years, did one course on copyrights for computer software. So I knew something about something that was new in the technology world at that time. I found myself taking a first job at a corporate securities law practice, actually in Beverly Hills, California, a very specialist boutique firm that did a lot of financings. And in fact, I found myself there at a up cycle for IPOs. So as a very junior first and second year associate in a law firm, I got to work on a bunch of IPOs. In fact, this particular law firm wasn't very good at maintaining long-term client relationships. It was just good at getting deals done. We knew how to get the SEC to approve all kinds of investment opportunities. And what I learned and observed in doing that was that the entrepreneurs who were launching these companies, getting them to IPO, in those days often without venture capital stages, they were having all the fun and making all the money. So I thought, what's wrong with this picture? I'm grunting away, getting paid a okay salary, but basically being measured by how many hours I worked. And I thought it seemed a lot more appealing to get measured by how much I contributed or how innovative I could be, or even just that my hard work would translate into a return that wasn't calculated based on hitting some hourly target. So I found myself working on an IPO for a computer company. It actually had a license to an operating system for a product set that probably nobody even knows today, a category called mini computers. And I learned a lot about computer software and hardware and the distribution dynamics of the computer industry in that time period. And basically, it was a chance to get a business education. I was general counsel of this public company. By the way, at age 29, it was probably verging on malpractice from a lawyer's point of view, but from a proxy for a business education, it turned out to be really valuable. Eventually, I took off my lawyer's hat and went full on to the business side. That occurred because this operating system that we had a license to was prominent in Europe, and we started to launch business activity in Western Europe. Having gone to Tufts and studied French and medieval French and conversational French, I was the only person in this New Jersey company that spoke any French. And the headquarters of our European operation was Paris. So the opportunity arose for me to take off my lawyer's hat completely, say that I was a business guy, move my family to Paris, and run a field operation, if you will, of this operating business. I was making it up as I was going along, including a little bit of the French, and I found myself really out there doing one of the most exciting things that I could have ever dreamed of. Even if it wasn't business and it wasn't entrepreneurial, I have to say I stayed in Paris for 5 years, probably the best experience of my life, including doing startups. I came back eventually, and while I had never lived in Northern California, it was obvious that if I wanted to stay in tech and pursue opportunities, I should move to the Bay Area. And I brought my family back, and we planted ourselves in Palo Alto, and I explored tech opportunities. So you've probably figured out from what I've said that I'm not an engineer. I don't write code. I had to find somebody that had some technology. And through a hard work on my extensive personal network, which really wasn't that great at that time, I found myself being introduced to a research team in the speech recognition lab at SRI International in Menlo Park. And that team had an urge to commercialize a long promised technology of speech recognition, the kind that we take for granted today because it works. Well, in 1992, 3, and 4, most people thought it would never work. And it took a long time to validate that it did. So I launched the company that I'm most known for, that was most successful, Nuance Communications, with 3 technical co-founders out of SRI. SRI gave us seed money to get started. I'll say a little bit more about that later. but let's just say it all worked. The company became a big company, as Josh referred to, and today it's a standalone independent business with about $2 billion of revenue. Not the same company that I left after 10 years, but I did make it through IPO. So in the last several years, I've been involved in startup land, both as entrepreneur in residence at Tufts, where I had to devise a course on entrepreneurial leadership. And you know, one of the things you hear about and then you realize when you do it is if you really want to learn something, try to teach it. And teaching entrepreneurial leadership was an experience of really understanding what I had learned or hadn't learned, and even what I needed to learn. So having done that, I found my way into a sort of a unique partnership with a global business in the category that we call brand tech. It's how technology gets used to market for brands. And so today I'm a partner in this company called You and Mr. Jones. And just one more word about that. All the DNA of the other partners is in the advertising industry, the historical experience that they brought. I brought the tech side, so they put me in charge of venture investments for You and Mr. Jones. And we had big raises, not as a fund, but as an operating business, where we could divert some of it to venture. In 5 years, I've made 23 venture investments. So I've gotten to sit on boards, be a board observer, and watch the process of venture capital from the other side of the table, if you will. So I'm not really a serial entrepreneur, but I've seen many, many startups and many more business plans.
Great. Thank you, Ron. You really kind of started getting into what my first question was going to be about, which is, I'll call it your personal why. If you think about your first startup, Kowsik, what was it that got you started? What were you trying to do or solve? Why'd you take the plunge and say, you know, I've got to start a company?
I think the first one was more, I'd say it's just a startup fever, just being in the Bay Area, and you see that all the time. And it was more of a feeling was, okay, I don't want to work for somebody else. I'm going to go do something on my own. And like I said, the first startup, very inexperienced. I just worked for 2 other startups before. And I had no, you know, me and another person that were trying to sketch out this idea, we had no idea what we were going to do. All we knew was we're going to start something. It didn't really matter. And so for 2 months, you know, we sort of soul searched. And interestingly enough, Ron, you know, I think my association with Nuance was right around that time. And this was long before such a thing as a mobile phone existed. And, you know, some of you, I'm kind of, you know, dating myself here, but some of you remember mobile phones call and web access, WAP. It was a text mode protocol that was very, very bad. So anyway, we're trying to work out this idea, and the most disappointing and at the same time the best feedback that I ever got was during an elevator pitch, during a pitch session with a VC. And I still today remember that quote. This person sitting across the table after about half an hour listening to us ramble all over the place, you know, he's like, this is the massively unscalable architecture for a problem that simply doesn't exist. You know, talking about just bursting the bubble, and it felt pretty bad for the rest of the day. But he was right. You know, we really didn't have anything other than just the need to go and do this. The second attempt, I'd say, was a bit more targeted. You know, I talked about my foray into cybersecurity. Ended up building this intrusion prevention device, and one of the things in that capacity and being sort of in the trenches of security, you realize that there's a difference between security software and secure software. In other words, even things that are there to protect, think about your antivirus and other types of things, are not necessarily secure in of itself. And so the core idea, which I'd say was about 2 decades ahead of its time, was a notion of fault injection. You typically learn about that in computer science courses. But the idea was we could interrogate any piece of software or any piece of hardware and scan and analyze and find bugs and vulnerabilities. And that was sort of the core idea. And part of it, again, like I said, came from seeing this happen over and over again, because our device that we built was responsible for protecting against these types of threats. And a lot of those threats happen because there's bugs in Windows or things like that. That was sort of the second attempt, right? It was much more based on experience, but I do want to say, just stepping back a little bit, again, I've done a number of startups, and I said, Juniper Networks was the only large company that I've ever worked for. Everything else has been smaller companies, and I'll maybe present like 4 different scenarios, and that sort of explains, how to think about this, right? I mean, part of gold is, always a reason to do a startup, but I know friends that have never worked in startups. They've just had big company jobs from the get-go, and they just like that. I know folks that have worked in a startup for 30 years and none of it went anywhere, just failure after failure after failure. Well, we don't want to call it failure, right? Learning experience after learning experience, and didn't really go anywhere. I know somebody, a good friend of mine who graduated with me, worked in 2 companies, both as an early employee, and both were huge success and became financially independent very quickly. And then last but not the least, on the far extreme, and I think we talked about, there's supposedly, there's a next panel where you're going to be talking about Tufts graduates that started companies. A couple of mine and friends that, graduated with me, they actually, as soon as we graduated grad school, when we all moved to the Bay Area, they took out a loan. And, at that time, seed funding and, angels and things like that didn't really exist. So they took out a loan right after grad school, and they built a company. Everything was completely bootstrapped, and they got bought in 3 or 4 years. It wasn't, again, the scheme of things, it wasn't like $1 billion unicorn or whatever, but, pretty much every single dollar at the end of that liquidation event went to their pockets, right? So anyway, 4 different scenarios. And I think in general, what I see is the why falls into 2 buckets. One is the urge to not work for somebody else. I think that's a big part of why people go and start something. And the second one is really about scratching an itch, right? You see an opportunity, you see there's something in the market that's missing for which you think you have a solution for, and there's an opportunity to go build a company to go solve that problem.
Excellent. Great. Thank you, Kowsik. In fact, you took my first follow-up, which was just describing as a VC how I see those 2 motivations for starting companies. That I've got to start a company where I'm going to figure out what it's going to be, often because I don't want to work for someone. And the other is I've seen a problem I just have to address and have to fix. I see both of those and have invested in entrepreneurs from each of those categories. I want to shift to the how. We've talked a little about why, and Kowsik, you mentioned a little of the financing, but I wanted to ask each of you, what were the mechanics of your first startup? Did you have co-founders? Was it solo? And did you bootstrap it or raise or self-fund it or raise venture capital? I want to keep the answers to this pretty tight. I want to make sure we get to a couple other topics before our Q&A. Kowsik, sorry, let's go to Ron. Ron, talk a little about kind of the how of your startups.
Well, I just want to offer an anecdote that addresses Kowsik's observation of the most insulting things that VCs can say to you. It does go to the startup phase of Nuance. We actually hosted a visit from Don Valentine of Sequoia Ventures, who recently passed away, but is a legendary figure in the Silicon Valley world. And my startup was me, as I said, and 3 technical co-founders who had been in the research lab at SRI. None of the 3 had ever had a job outside of pure research. That's not considered usually a good training ground for commercialization or commercial business activity. And sitting across the table from the 3 of them, Don Valentine looked them in the eye and said, "How do I know that you're not now genetically deficient because you've essentially spent your life in a cave?" The comeuppance for all that was that, in fact, they made a product work at scale in the real world on a difficult technology that had never been successfully deployed, and proved that they were not genetically deficient at all. In fact, pretty wonderful guys and brilliant technologists. So that was our founding group. The way it happened is there was an urge to commercialize coming out of the laboratory level of SRI, but not so much from the senior management, which was basically ivory tower research-oriented leadership. But with some persistence, and persistence I think is the key word, I hung around without receiving much of income. I had a small stipend to stimulate this activity for 14 months before we convinced the management to allow the spin out to happen. And when we did, they decided to go for it in those days in a pretty big way. They gave us $1 million of seed money at a time when SRI really didn't have $1 million to spare. They do much better now because they've learned to commercialize all the great research that goes on there. They gave us a license to the core technology, which had been in development in the lab for at least 10 or 15 years with hundreds of $1 million of research funding. And they said, go at it and go raise venture capital before your $1 million runs out, and you've got a startup. The one thing that I didn't understand too much about at the time was for that initial license of software and $1 million of cash, they took 63% of the company. That didn't leave a lot for the founders and the new investors by the time we actually went and raised money. But there is a lesson here, which you often hear, and we really lived, which is it's much better to have a small slice of a very big pie than a big slice of a not so big pie. And so none of us as founders are complaining today that we had such a small share relative to somebody else. And it wouldn't have happened without that kind of unique setup. And even more to the point, SRI has now templated that model, maybe not 63%, but on a regular basis does startups, many of which have been quite successful, including Siri, came out of SRI, lab next to us. A giant company called Intuitive Surgical in the medical remote robotics space was built out of SRI technology, and many others. So the model of spin out from research is a very interesting one. By the way, I investigated that when I was at Tufts. I didn't know if Tufts was doing a good job. When I say at Tufts as an entrepreneur in residence, at commercializing all the great technology that might come out of the medical school and the veterinary school and the various science departments and so forth. Of course, it turns out that there's Professor DeWalt in the chemistry department that's built 2 multi-billion-dollar companies that do gene sequencing. And then there's everybody else. So Tufts has some significant success with that model as well. And some venture capitalists play in that model to find really interesting technologies. So it's one way to launch a tech startup.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Ron. I think Shreya's panel will be interesting next month because we'll be hearing how things may have changed in the funding environment with entrepreneurs who started their startup in the last probably 5 years or so. I wanted to shift a little bit now, and Kowsik, let me start with you. I want to ask more about the entrepreneurs you've worked with, or maybe for yourself. What are the top 2 or 3 traits in those people that are most likely to lead to success?
So the 2, I'd say, that really stands out for me personally. The first one is really about being frugal and scrappy, not cheap, but just being incredibly aware that you run out of money, you don't have a startup, period. You can't pay anybody, you can't pay yourself, and you just go belly up, right? So I think it's very important to be frugal and scrappy. And the characteristic I think is also slightly different between the first timers versus people that are doing it all over again, like for example, Ron right now. The second one is really about doggedness, right? I mean, there's a quote, some people attribute that to Churchill. So though on the internet, you would hear that it's not from him. is basically success is going from failure to failure with complete relentless enthusiasm. Okay, it's about just showing up every single day and making it work, and against all odds. So I think those two to me stand out pretty well. And I said the second time around and the subsequent times, I think it gets a little bit easier because one, you have the name brand, and you also have the experience of the first startup where you learn pretty quickly all the things that you shouldn't be doing when you're building a company. And ultimately, all said and done, the market has such a huge part to play, and luck has a big part to play as well, right? And an amazing idea and an amazing product is really only relevant if the market wants it. And so, anyways, I think the two that stand out for me are just Frugal and Scrappy, and just the doggedness. You want to get it done.
Yeah, I think I'll emphasize, both of those are important to investors. Being frugal, you may not realize how much investors and venture capitalists talk about your startup. And one of the things we talk about with each other is how much have you accomplished with whatever you had before you're coming to us for this round. And it's always impressive when someone raised $50,000 or $200,000 and they accomplished an incredible amount. So I absolutely agree with, both what Ron mentioned and perseverance earlier, and Kowsik being scrappy and frugal, absolutely key. Ron, are there traits that you kind of feel like you didn't have, you wish you had? What are the things that, you maybe admire or see in other entrepreneurs that you either had to push yourself to do on your own, or something you realize you didn't natively have?
What comes to mind now, I don't know if I realized this at the time because maybe I looked this way. I'm going to say fearlessness. That is, you have to realize in life, but certainly in venture and in startup land, that you aren't going to get something unless you ask for it. And you aren't going to get it unless you step forward without fear of being rejected and beaten down. You have to put yourself forward to accomplish what you want and to get others to join in and cooperate. And if you're afraid of rejection, it's not a good zone to operate in. It's going to happen all the time. And we all have pride, and we all have certain insecurities and certain, obviously, degrees of self-confidence. But mastering that is really key. What I think we see in in today's world of Y Combinator graduates and all of that is basically a willingness to be fearless no matter what and ask for whatever is possible. And oftentimes you get it. So I did refer to persistence before. The observation about persistence is there are actually very few overnight sensations. From a distance, it looks like all the winners are these incredible unicorn overnight brilliant sensations, but almost all of them are the result of hard work. And in fact, in the Valley, there's a culture of worshiping hyper-growth businesses and more or less not talking too much about everything else, but almost every business is everything else. There are only a small handful of hyper-growth stories. And when you're running one that isn't a hyper-growth story, you have to be dogged, you have to be persistent, you can't give up, and it's hard. And I see that as a venture investor. We've lost very few, but the ones that could have been lost are working only because of the persistence of the founding team and the entrepreneurs.
Yes, that's excellent. Thank you. I'll throw in one myself that just occurred to me. One of the things I really admire in entrepreneurs who are pitching me for their startup is what I'll call being self-aware. You actually see this far more in young CEOs, or see the issue I'll address, which is feeling like it makes you look bad to say, I don't know. And more experienced entrepreneurs know that investors admire and like that. If you're self-aware, you're very confident in your sales and marketing plan or your technology, but you don't understand another aspect of, getting to market or something, or writing a contract, doing your first proposal, an RFQ, those kinds of things. Ask for help. Venture capitalists like it. They don't see it as a sign of weakness. They see it as a sign of strength when you say, I don't know how to do this. I'm looking for help. I love that when entrepreneurs ask me that. If they're afraid to ask for help, it's actually a warning sign. So be ready to say, I don't know, or I'd like help, or can you connect me with someone? It really serves you well. Let me move on a little bit and talk about timing, and which will bring us to kind of the discussion of what it's like today or how it may have changed. But in general, let's start with this. Is there a right time to break off of your comfortable career and job and, family situation? If you have one, is there a right time to break off and do a startup? Or is it more of a personal thing? It's either something in the industry or it's something personal in your career. Any thoughts on that, Kowsik, about timing and the right time to do it?
First off, I'll say I know this panel is really around starting companies and and the entrepreneurship, but not everyone wants to start a company, and that's totally fine. And the second one that I say is, I think before anybody jumps in, really try to understand what is it that you want out of it. And so most recently, a buddy of mine, we've known each other for a very long time, since I moved to the Valley, and he called me, he's like, hey, I worked on this project and I have a patent and the patent is assigned to me, and all of a sudden I've got all these people that are asking for support, and like, how do I raise money? And my question to him wasn't, or my answers to him weren't exactly, here's how you do it, but it's like, what is it that you want? Do you want to build a company with all of these people that you really want to scale out, or are you looking for a lifestyle business, or that's sort of the extremes of it? But what is it that you want? And in terms of timing, I think there's a few different buckets that I've seen. I think the first one, I talked about this early on, the urge to not having to work for somebody else. At some point, you're basically like, okay, you know what? If everybody else can do this, so can I. So I'm going to go and figure it out what I want to do. So that's a good timing to start a company. At least in tech, a big bucket happens to be based on prior experience. So, you work for a company, you meet customers, you meet investors, you have these conversations, and then based on the experience, you realize that there's a gap in the market that is unsolved, or you hear about problems from the customers that are completely unrelated to the company that you're currently working for. And then you look around, you realize, okay, you know what, there's nothing there. So that is obviously, a sort of second bucket of when people decide to start. And the last one is a bit of the visionary kind, which is a very, very rare breed, right? It's truly sitting there and going, I am going to imagine a future that absolutely doesn't exist. Nobody's ever thought about it, but to me, it makes sense. I think it's going to make sense for everybody else. That's a bit of a rare breed. But I'd say, ultimately there's that inner compass that just at some point, you're ready, and you'll know if you're ready. You can read all the books you want, but for the parents on the panel, it's like having a baby, right? You can read all the books and talk to your friends and etc. But at some point, it's your baby, and you just know when you're ready for it. And then I'd say one other point, just in terms of the timing, is the barrier to entry for starting a company now compared to 2 decades ago is so much lower. At least for the enterprise business, a couple of decades ago, you needed a massive cash infusion, really deep technology, a big, big team, loads of infrastructure, even before you can get to the MVP, the minimally viable product, just so that you can validate that idea actually has a market. But now with all this different, the angels, the seed rounds, the cloud infrastructure, Ron talked about News Combinator, Y Combinator. And so there's so many services now. In some ways it can be liberating, but it also means there's so many people that are potentially competing for your idea.
It's a great point.
I just wanted to interject
okay, go ahead, Judy.
A couple of questions from the audience that are coming in. Thank you, Kowsik. And this is more directed to Ron. A comment just from someone agreeing with your thought about telling entrepreneurs that his words are, this is from Mark Dwanchik, I like to tell young entrepreneurs that all of the successes, especially here in Silicon Valley, are, quote, 7-year overnight successes, unquote. And no one talks about all the companies that can't make it through those first few years of struggle. So just an underscoring of what you were referring to in terms of persistence. And another question for you, Ron, around as we, I think we're going to be moving from a reflection back to kind of a forward thinking look, but in terms of reflecting back, what was the most challenging decision you had to make at Nuance in its early stage startup phase?
Well, a lot of thoughts come to mind in a couple of those observations. Getting Nuance launched was difficult. It took actually a change of leadership at the top of SRI to take a new attitude about commercialization. And probably the hardest thing was to decide whether just to hang in there through a long, laborious cycle of trying to evangelize the idea that a startup, a spin-off made sense. There was also questions about assembling the startup team, like who was ready to go and take the risks. And there were actually 4 logical candidates who more or less had created the prototype product or the base code. And they each had different personalities, and one of them didn't make it across the line. We actually prepared the founder's share certificate with his name on it, and he just couldn't walk in the front door on the actual day of opening the business. And knowing how to get the team stood up and get going is really an adventure. It's one decision or another might make a difference. It's knowing when to decide, it's time to go, you're either in or you're out, we can't talk about it anymore. And then making the right arrangements so that everybody feels productive and bought in. Those are the startup challenges.
I'd just say,
Excellent.
just in terms of convincing people, I think when I started the company, I remember having so many, I was convinced, my co-founder was convinced, obviously we're going to go do this. I remember having so many conversations with the founding team. Each person, I knew them, I'd worked with them, but we would have these extended conversations in their homes with their spouses, sitting down and basically just trying to convince, right? Your sell. And, in typical enterprise sales, there's what's called the ABC. It's always be closing. You never stop selling it's selling to investors, it's the pitch deck, it's the founders, it's the hiring team. It's, you just sell the entire time.
Absolutely. Great thoughts from both of you. Let me remind the audience, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. Thank you for those submitting questions. I see a few coming in. Feel free to ask a question either generally to all of us or to a specific one of our speakers, if there's anything you'd like us to discuss. Look, we'd be remiss if I didn't throw in one more kind of topic about the when question. And that's kind of the massive shifts we're living through right now, the disruption between important social justice causes and racial inequalities coming to the forefront of our daily lives, and a deadly global pandemic we're living through. Do either of you have specific thoughts for today's, possible entrepreneurs or young entrepreneurs about what may be changing in terms of doing startups or getting them funded? Anything particular to we're seeing in the world these days?
I'll say a couple words about that and then talk about my personal ambition. There's a truism in the Valley that it's not a difficult or problematic thing to do a startup when the economy is in a trough, when things are bad. In fact, it's often thought that's the best time to start. Venture capitalists, if they have cash, aren't looking for the next quarter's financial return or result and performance of the company. They know it's a long-term development process. And if you're going to start at the peak, you're likely to wind up trying to work your way through the trough later. So I think per se being in a mess like we are now is not a impediment to starting a company. On the side of the table where I sit with you and Mr. Jones, we have sort of said, well, let's just hold on to our horses because nobody exactly knows what's going to happen. And so while we don't make a public announcement, there's a definite resistance to doing new deals until you sort of get clarity on the overall environment. And you do spend a lot more time, this is what all venture capitalists will tell you, nursing the existing portfolio as opposed to looking for new deals, because these challenging economic circumstances do imperil the medium stage companies that are trying to grow and get customers and so forth. And that's, unless you're in the e-commerce or the virtual side of the world where some businesses with venture investments are doing incredibly well. We've got a few that weren't doing so well and now they're doing pretty well based on having products that help in the e-commerce space, for example. But obviously everybody understands that Zoom and Peloton and other work from home, live at home products have done amazingly well. But the case that Josh referred to, for me is I got motivated by the problems I was seeing in our dealing with the pandemic and the risk of safety and comfort for consumers venturing out into a world that was going to reopen without any infrastructure to support the safety and the information necessary to make prudent decisions about where to go and what to do. So I guess it comes under the heading of purpose. And I would say that there's a permanent shift, I think, in all businesses, and I think in startups and in startup land, where purpose has been resorted into a higher order priority on the stack. I mean, it's true at you and Mr. Jones. It's true in the companies we invest in, and it's a driver of this business that I've started, which has to do with the reopening safely in the context of COVID-19 and future disease and virus and epidemics and so forth. So I just want to put in a 1-minute plug. The ring over my shoulder is our logo. I thought I was going to get a chance to comment on the startup experience to say that the most fun thing you can do is design a logo, and the least fun thing you can do is try to pick a name because it's extremely challenging. But I'm not going to tell you the name of the startup. We're still in stealth mode, but we do have a logo. And I will say that this startup process is very much about sweat equity and about calling on my personal network and friends and extended relations of friends. So if there are any interested and motivated Tufts engineers or Tufts marketing people or Tufts startup people who are curious and interested in a cool startup, we're putting together the next part of the founding team, let's say, and standing up a company. So I'd be happy to hear from you.
There's a related question here, Ron, and it may be a bit tangential, but one of the audience members is asking about the decision point at which you decide to stay with what you're currently doing versus walk away. How long to stick it out, knowing how long to stick it out versus walk away. Though hindsight's 2020, what are some criteria if you're not sure whether you're in or out when you reach a point where things don't seem to be working at a startup? And that may not have been the case for you when you decided to pivot and move to your newest venture, but in the vein of making that transition, what would you say were sort of the decision set you and Kowsik to be able to make a shift from one venture to another?
Well, I'm in a very unusual position because I'm actually at a stage of life where I wasn't really looking to do a startup, and I'm actually very happy in the job I'm in. It's really kind of interesting to be making venture investments. So I'm trying to walk a very delicate line between doing everything it takes to stand up this startup and maintaining a very successful and enjoyable relationship. My version of the answer of when's the right time to leave and do something is the sooner the better. I taught my students, at Tufts, that true job security comes from being able to employ yourself and do your own startup. And that's one of the effects of this pandemic. I mean, there are so many people who are high performers, qualified, were doing a great job in the companies that they were in and all the startups and tech businesses in the Valley, who have been laid off or who have been furloughed or who have been set back in what seemed like their natural career path. And what would they have been able to do if they were off on their own, building their portfolio of capability that says I can be self-sustaining. I can run my own activity, whether it be a tech business, a product business, or even a service business in this community. There's many opportunities. So I'm into freeing yourself of the illusion that working your way up in a big company provides any great comfort or security. It does provide education. I agree with what Kowsik said before. But when you've exhausted your education and the reward is the funnel is going all the other direction, I think it's time to figure out how you can do something on your own.
My answer
Right.
about when to how long to stick it out, I'd say, if you're a co-founder, it can be completely heart-wrenching because it's your baby and you cannot walk away no matter how south it goes. But there is such a thing as risk rewards, and you hear stories about people taking equity loans and whatnot on their house and just keep trying to get it going until to some logical conclusion. And so it can be very, very difficult. I don't know if there is a straight answer or one particular answer to say, if you get to point A, then it's time to kill the startup and move on to the next job, right? So I think there's been success stories around pivoting. People have hit a wall and decided that market just went away for them, and they decided to, find an adjacent space or a slightly related problem and then come out ahead. So I don't know if there's a single answer or single point in time where you decide, I'm done with my company, I'm going to fold it.
That's great. Thank you, Kowsik. I've got plenty of questions for our panelists, but look, we're running short on time. I'm going to turn it over to Judy to bring up more of the excellent questions coming in from the audience.
Yeah, we do have a few, and they're sort of in disparate directions. So one comment was, it seems like these examples are huge startups, but then it seems the experiences we're hearing about, how are they applicable to mom and pop startups? I'm
happy to comment on that. Again, like I said, there's a whole range of them. There's lifestyle businesses. It's just two people and you've got a site going and maybe you're serving ads and you've got, Etsy or something like that. You're making something and that's totally fine, right? Again, it all depends on, at a personal level, what do you want out of this? If you're looking for a lifestyle business and not having to work for somebody else, there's a certain path that you take. And the way you build a business, the way you raise the money, the way you hire people, the size of the company, all of that depends on what you want out of it. And then, is on the other side is you, from the get-go, you want to make a big difference, and that's okay too.
The Silicon Valley model is wired to big bets that pay off enormously. I skipped over it, but I had a startup 10 years ago that didn't go very far. And I found myself pitching Reid Hoffman, who obviously has been incredibly successful, PayPal and LinkedIn and great venture capitalist. And by the way, he has a podcast called Masters of Scale, which tells it all, because what he said to me was, I'm not totally sure I get what you're saying. Come back when you can show me how you go from 1 unit to 100 million units in the shortest possible time. And if you can demonstrate that in your model, I'm in. And there aren't that many businesses that actually do that, but that's what a venture capitalist is typically interested in. It's an oversimplification, but actually he made the oversimplification, I think, not me. And that's basically a mindset.
Somebody that I know basically built a training platform, and it was just him and a bunch of people, and many of them are contractors, and completely bootstrapped, not a single dollar VC money. And he's built a training platform that many of the networking vendors, the really, really large ones, public companies traded in the Bay Area. They all use the platform, but it was one person with the team of consultants and contractors. And again, that's a model, and that's totally cool if that's the direction you want to pursue it. And I think there's plenty of opportunities there as well.
Great. We're running short on time, but Judy, let's try to keep going as long as we can.
Question from Kip Denoyer about how do you navigate non-solicits if you have former colleagues you want to bring on board?
I guess you have to respect them. I was trained as a lawyer. Venture capitalists don't like deals with what they say. They call it, this deal has hair on it. And if you have any overhang of uncertainty from an IP point of view, or this kind of competitive non-solicitation question, I don't know. I mean, maybe you can go get a lawyer for your company, and they can read the details and understand the specific case and give you some comfort that you don't have a problem, but maybe you do. There is a general belief that California doesn't enforce non-competes very well. I'm not totally sure about non-solicitation. That might be just slightly different.
Yeah, I'd say,
especially,
go ahead, Josh.
In my experience, it is different, and VCs in California will care a lot about non-solicitations. Entrepreneur, the CEO is going to have to sign off before a financing that there's nothing else that hasn't been disclosed. And this will be one of those items. Is everyone on the team free and clear to work for the company right now? And you have to answer honestly to that, or you could face some dire situations with your board later. Sorry, Kowsik, go ahead.
No, yeah, I was just going to say, if you're working for a large company and then you leave to start your own, and if the new idea that you're working on has anything even remotely connected to your parent, the company that you just left, be that much extra careful, because they can come after you, and you really just want a clean break, not just for yourself, but also the people that you hire.
So I'll just throw a final question out there. This is from Stephen Weinstein. Any insights into how VC investors are balancing the competing needs of producing returns for limited partners versus waiting out the market to see what's going to happen, given such an unusual period going on right now?
I'll take that as someone who's recently been working in venture capital. And look, it's a difficult time. Every venture capitalist I know is dealing with their current portfolio and triaging those that, as Kowsik mentioned, may be benefiting from what's happening right now, to the larger group who is struggling. So walking in with a new startup right now is really tricky. But look, VCs, typically are doing this for an 8 to 10 year horizon. They're investing long term to build something that is big, that can go public, that could stand on its own to be $1 billion company. As Ron said, this is actually a good time to raise money if you've got a case that can get through the noise right now. But for the most part, VCs, while they are busy triaging their portfolio and helping the current companies survive and maybe change or pivot, they're looking at new deals, and they're doing that with that long-term horizon. Judy, we can go a couple minutes longer. I want to make sure we get a couple more audience questions in.
Josh, the other way that VCs can arbitrate that balance is there's a price mechanism that gets adjusted. So if they're concerned about things going to take longer, or it's a very higher degree of uncertainty, you could see them adjusting price. And that's a commonly accepted view that pre-money valuations are lower now. I haven't
Absolutely.
seen it firsthand, but you can expect that.
Yeah, no, it is true. And look, valuation is a reflection of a risk-reward calculation the VC is making. That's what it is. And when it's times of greater risk, you should expect valuations may be lower, and the bar may be higher to getting a deal actually through the partnership and to funding. So yes, very true. Good point.
There's a question from Chad Perbeck, more having to do with your personal reflection on this. What was your biggest challenge in starting your own business, your biggest challenge? And what is your greatest resource in getting through it?
I can take that one. I guess I'll go first. So starting the company for me, I'd say that wasn't the challenge. So just based on prior relationship, the seed money actually came in within a week after we incorporated, and we were just off and running. But in hindsight, I'd say, hindsight is always 20/20. In hindsight, I'd say maybe we should have waited just to validate the idea a bit more before we could go and raise it. I'd say the biggest challenge, and I think a lot of companies right now are facing that, is when there's a downturn. We hit 2008, and that was not a pretty sight, right? The market simply just went the other way. Like all of our customers stopped buying, and that's not a pretty place. So I think, the thing that you need to realize with startups is it's pretty much a roller coaster ride every single day, right? Everybody loves you day one. And then day two, when you wake up, it's like, oh my God, the whole world hates me. And it's just, and you go through this until eventually it kind of evens out and you kind of will it. But so personally, I think for me that, it was about 3 years into the company, which was the very, very challenging part, which is 2008.
And what I could say, the observation was made, one reason to start a company is because you don't want to have a boss. And I actually was embarrassed to say that publicly. I'm glad Kowsik started saying it because I thought it was a bit of a character defect, perhaps, that I didn't really have the comfort to work for a boss. But maybe this goes with the flip side of that is you actually do have a boss when you are the CEO of your own company. In fact, unfortunately, of many bosses, you have all of your employees, and modern leadership and management practice says that the boss, the CEO, really works for the employees. And I think you have to wear that hat. And then you actually have board members who kind of look like bosses to the CEO, who sits in front of them every 6 or 8 weeks or once a quarter and has to answer probing, challenging questions. So my personal reflection, I really needed to learn that those apparent bosses were actually trying to help, because my rather immature reaction as a green behind the ears kind of CEO was, wait a minute, they're challenging me on stuff that I don't really want to be challenged on. Why are they doing that? And so that's actually an adaptation that can be learned. There are skills about how to operate in that chair under those circumstances, but the realization that you actually probably do always have a boss, even if it's the customer or the market, comes with the fantasy that you can start your own thing and not have a boss.
Well, look, with that was a great wrapping, concluding statement, Ron. Thank you. With that, we're over our time, and there's a lot of great questions coming in from the audience. I'm very sorry we didn't get more time to answer them. But let me thank all of the attendees. Let me thank our 2 panelists, Judy as my co-host, and the teams behind the scenes who are making all this work. Thank you all. I look forward to seeing you at the next Amplify Online event at the end of July. So thanks, Ron. Thanks, Kowsik. And we'll see you all. We'll talk to you all soon.